A popular question today is, what is the best way to deal with fascist arguments? How can you properly lay out the logical inconsistencies in fascist ideology for everyone to see how much of a sham it all is, once and for all putting the ideas to rest? Of course, this question has only been becoming more prevalent recently simply because more people are becoming infatuated with far-right ideology and with it, modern forms of fascism, calling for the establishment of ethno-states and a return to traditional values. There's quite a clear-cut answer to this question though, and as you've probably already guessed, it's that you have to be a Marxist. And in this video we'll be explaining why that is. Although, rather than go over what makes Marxism such an effective analysis of society, as has already been done in many of my other videos you can watch in the card section, we'll be taking a look at what makes liberalism so ineffective. In fact, we can say what that is right now. When a society starts to deteriorate, produce further alienation, social tension, and economic stress, the status quo becomes questioned, and, as you can imagine, anyone representing the status quo is left in quite a difficult spot to answer for the ills brought about by their ideology. Today, that status quo is liberalism, and its challengers are the fascists. Now, I don't want to hear your excuses that you're actually an enlightened or centrist who thinks everybody is wrong, or a classical liberal who's actually the oppressed one under the feminist system. Feminist system! Or you're just an anti-capitalist because you're a Bernie Sanders supporter. On the scope of the core principles that our society is based on, compared to that of the fascists, you are the status quo. No matter how fringe you think you are on today's conventional political spectrum, the fascists are always an order of magnitude more fringe. Because at the end of the day, you want a flavour of liberalism, and they do not. Now, a pretty firm line can be drawn between the two main types of liberals, and as such, two main ways that this phenomena has occurred, and as such we'll be talking about both of them today. This is between the classical or conservative liberals and the progressive liberals. Now, I do understand that it can be quite frustrating when Marxists take what are considered to be two diametrically opposed groups and lump them together under the same term as liberal. But please do understand that from the perspective all the way over here at the far left, the fine details between progressive drones and classical drones becomes a little redundant. The conservative liberals, who we'll be starting with first because I know they have a shorter attention span, are the types who are not only ignorant to how fascism grows or merited them being liberals, but then they're also the types who sometimes seem like they're trying to propel fascist rhetoric into the mainstream. Their rallying cry for doing so, of course, being to trigger the libs. Now, what do I mean when I talk about these liberals being unable to effectively argue against the fascists of today? Well, what better example to draw on than the infamous Sargon versus Spencer debate? This debate showed such poor performance from Sargon that I think for the first time ever, his fans acknowledged that he lost. But to cut Sargon some slack, I honestly think there's pretty much no way he could have gained any ground here. His own debating skills aside, he had sealed himself into a position of defeat from the very start by simply believing what he does. In my video, The Classical Liberals' Descent into Fascism, which of course you've already seen, I make the point that classical liberals, i.e. the more conservative liberals, usually focus on the same or at least similar societal issues that the alt-right do. Prime examples include being anti-immigration, anti-feminism / anti-progressive, concerned about the preservation of gender roles or culture, and usually working in the interests of the white man, as seen in instances such as affirmative action or joining in with the alt-right in claims that progressives hate white men, as seen when they unquestionably pick up the phrase, "it's okay to be white," something that was literally brought up by some alt-righters on 4chan. But as I also said in that video, and as I'm also going to have to emphasize here and still have people misunderstand me, none of these things make classical liberals and the alt-right similar as political ideologies. Classical liberals are just that, liberals, while the alt-right are a populist anti-establishment group that usually question the main tenets of liberalism, such as individual liberty. Nonetheless though, the fact that both of these groups focus on very similar issues and have very similar enemies does lead to a very interesting paradigm that sets the liberals up to be at a disadvantage whenever they face against fascists. Now from here it's tempting to fall back into making the same points that I already have in my video specifically on this topic, that classical liberals set up the case for the fascists to simply come along and say, let's actually do something about this, rather than just getting angry on Twitter. Or simply adding that it's the Jews who are behind the feminist media monopoly. But I'd encourage anyone who hasn't to simply go watch that video instead. Rather, what we'll focus on here is how this restrains liberals from actually dealing with fascists when they're confronted with them. This being because they work on the same grounding that the alt-right do. And to actually challenge the alt-right on this means undermining their own positions. If they start trying to backpedal on the feminist system, they end up arguing against themselves. So rather, you have to try and pin down Spencer on who counts as white.
I know it's
exactly.
not contradictory.
Sargon, is Lawrence Fishburne white? Is Lawrence Fishburne white?
Because what you're saying
is Lawrence Fishburne white?
Did you stop beating your wife yet? Because that's what you're doing. Listen, right?
It's not the equivalent question.
You can see this in the debate Sargon had with Spencer, as he pretty much spends the entire time trying to argue the specific practicalities of a white ethno-state. Because that's all he really has available to him.
Is Samuel Jackson white? Is Samuel Jackson white?
I think this is a goal.
Oh, the answer is no, Sargon. The answer is no, Sargon. Thank you.
All he can do is try and explain why, in practice, the ethno-state is a bad idea. But I would suggest that the question of practicality is wholly irrelevant to the question.
What about someone who's like a deeply tanned Italian?
The method in use here is how liberalism is forced to treat all instances of populism, both left and right, that being straight dismissal. See, to someone already infatuated with the alt-right, or at least flirting, the ethno-state or some variant of it represents change, a breakaway from liberal society which they deem has screwed them over, and I mean in a lot of cases it actually has. What we have here is a group of alienated and disgruntled individuals who believe that they have found the solution to their problems. The way liberalism treats the solution is again very similar to how it treats the notion of communism, constantly reaffirming that the current state of society is as good as it gets, that hope is merely a dangerous illusion, and attaching the terms of unrealistic and impractical to the proposed alternatives. Read capitalist realism, but anyway. This is, however, a fundamentally unsustainable way to suppress these populist movements due to capitalism's own workings. While taking the position of the down-to-earth moderate who brings starry-eyed radicals back down to earth works in times of relative prosperity, it has never in history worked when the need for change becomes increasingly more urgent due to capitalism's own turmoil. It's something that, like a lot of things under neoliberalism, rests on dogma, and dogma always becomes challenged eventually. Now, when I say dogma, under liberalism, we're talking about things like individual liberty or the idea that racism is bad. Common things that, even if one group wants to say the other doesn't hold, that they're racist or hate freedom, the accused group always has to deny, as it's a common dogma that they hold to be correct. Just because these things are dogmas doesn't mean that they're wrong or bad, but it does mean that when you do get groups that openly challenge these dogmas, the defenders of the status quo won't have any experience dealing with that. Take the example of racism. The majority of people don't have a fleshed out response to the question, why is racism bad? Because it's never something they've really had to deal with, at the very least in a debate format. But this isn't necessarily the case with fascists, and the same also goes with individual liberty.
The purpose of the state, in say, Britain, as conceived of by Locke, is the protection of the rights of the individual.
As conceived of by Locke, that state was not invented by Locke. That state has a history far greater than Locke. It's ridiculous.
Of course, in the real world, you won't get a fascist who outright says, I am a racist, at least if they're smart. Instead, you'll get something along the lines of, why is it racist for white people to work in their own interests, or something similar like that. But the principle remains the same. When liberals are left with no other recourse but to accuse racism or make weak arguments in the case of the classical liberals, the fascists get to play up their narrative that the liberals just cry out racism and or fascism in order to censor them because they themselves have no real arguments, thus pushing people to the right. The context in which the fascists are able to do this is brought about by the liberals themselves. The progressives, by genuinely resorting to the label racist in place of actual arguments, and the classicals by making out that this is the end of the world. We can see this in practice when Gary Young from Channel 4 went to interview Richard Spencer on his positions and try and confront him. Now, I'm sure you've all already seen it, but to refresh your memory, here are some of the highlights.
Africans have benefited from their experience with white supremacy. And we just have to look at the...
Really? I'm just going to leave that out there. I'm just going to leave that out. You know, that is not even worth challenging. You have that. Really. So slavery was good for them.
Look, they benefited from being in a different nation than their own, no doubt.
Really?
No doubt. How can you deny it?
So
Yeah.
you're really proud of your racism, aren't you? You're really proud to be a bigot.
I'm proud to be a white man.
You're proud to, that's different from being proud to be a bigot.
If Africans had never existed, world history would be almost exactly the same as it is today.
Yeah, you just keep
Because we are the genius that drives it.
Things.
Now, essentially, this ticks every box of specifically why progressive liberals are at such a disadvantage when dealing with fascists like Spencer toe-to-toe. They're simply inexperienced to deal with such claims like slavery was good, actually. Young can then only stand in disbelief as Spencer bats out one outlandish claim after the next, call him a racist, and then storm out. It's no fault of Young, though. Any journalist from Channel 4 would have been in the exact same position. It's a consequence of his lack of revolutionary ideals, and we'll get to that more later. Of course, it's completely possible for individual liberals to hone in their debating skills, become equipped on how to deal with arguments against dogma, and learn alt-right rhetoric patterns. But remember, we're looking at things on a systemic scope here. So while you can have the odd liberal who's quick on their feet in a debate and is effective against the alt-right, I'd even say Destiny is an example of this, who still won't debate me on Marxism, by the way, it doesn't change the underlying fact that liberals by default are susceptible to falling into these alt-right rhetoric traps. By fascism's own nature, at any point in history, it's just the standard for it to play off of liberals' own self-imposed weaknesses. That's just how it works on a systemic level and will continue to work as long as liberals exist. There are, though, many progressive liberals who do recognise the trouble that they seem to have debating fascists, but then only conclude from this that they just shouldn't engage with fascists in this manner at all. The common sentiment is something along the lines of, we shouldn't debate fascists because progressive ideals are simply more nuanced and require more explaining to do, while fascism relies purely on rhetoric and sound bites, putting us as an inherent disadvantage in a debate context. Now, while it's nice to believe that you're just too intelligent to debate fascists, in reality, it's because of the positions you actually hold, and their ineffectiveness at fighting fascism on ideological grounds. Progressives, though, do have one advantage on the conservative liberals, that being that they have no reason to go along with the alt-right assertions about the present state of society. The best tools the progressives have is simply disproving empirical claims to reduce fear-mongering and alarmism that the alt-right tried to cultivate, while of course the classical liberals just end up joining them in doing so. If you take a watch of any one of Sean's videos, you'll see that he has to take his time to establish grounding to his argument, lay out all the facts, and then step by step go through why whatever ridiculous claim the fascists that we're making is inaccurate. There's no soundbite version of this, and there's simply no time to carry it out in a live debate, which is where the notion that progressive ideals aren't suited to live debates comes from. Now, simply making these empirical refutations is effective, but the fact that it's progressivism's main and really only tool against fascism is very telling, as while it's an effective tool, it's still a flawed one. When you take an entirely empirical approach, as it were, without any ideological grounding, you're essentially saying that the fascists are only wrong as long as their facts are wrong. It means if we wake up tomorrow and suddenly all, or hell, even half of the claims that the alt-right make are suddenly true, most liberals are obliged to become fascists, but not a Marxist. Now, I get that the underlying claim here, that fascists are wrong even if they're right, is a little weird. So, to probably demonstrate my point, I want to use a clip from Zizek.
As we all know, in psychoanalysis especially, we know how knowledge does not necessarily involve truth, even if it is a true knowledge in the sense of adequate knowledge. For example, we all know, I hope they're so well known, Lacan's outrageous statement that even if, it's a little bit male chauvinist, but nonetheless, even if a jealous husband claims that his wife is cheating him, that she sleeps around with other men, even if they are all true, his jealousy is still pathological. So that, the factual truth can be, or adequacy, can be combined with untruth. Why? Let me give you a much more traumatic example, which makes the same point clearly. Let's take what Nazis claimed about the Jews. I think we have to go to the end here and claim, even if, okay, not all, I wouldn't go so far, but even if some of what they claimed was true, nonetheless, anti-Semitism was totally a lie, a fake. Why? I think that's my general point, that the moment you even think about endorsing, accepting discussion at this level, like for example, let's say, I don't know, I'm a Nazi, you are an honest liberal, and I say Jews seduce our young girls, Jews exploit us. And I say this. You say, no, this is a lie. Then comes a naive university neutral idiot and says, oh, it's difficult. Let's take an objective look at it. You sell your soul to the devil into this. Because let's be clear, the result will be unambiguous. Yes, the Nazis exaggerated it, but not quite. Because, wait a minute, now let's say something horrible. Many Jews were also rich in Germany. So yes, they definitely exploited Germans. On the other hand, I hope so. It's normal. I think that some Jews definitely probably were seducing German girls. Why not? You know what I mean? Why is this false? Because the true, how do you put it, the Nazis here, even if it were to be true, but it wasn't, of course, they lied in the guise of truth. Because the true question is not, is it true what they are claiming about the Jews? The true question is why, in order to sustain their politics, they need this fantasy of the Jew.
So to reiterate, fascists are scum regardless of how right they are. If liberals can only rest on the fact that the alt-right are making factually false claims, then they will always have a fundamentally flawed approach to dealing with their arguments. The source then of proper ideological resistance, and most importantly, ideological alternative to fascism, can never be the status quo that liberalism is, but only a radical communist movement. The main reason being that it simply doesn't have all the problems that we've discussed about liberalism. Even if again we assume that the fascists are completely right, that the world really is run by a Jewish cabal, the Marxist analysis of society remains completely unchanged, because it's a systemic one. Something that the fascists actually share in common with liberals is that they both have a very individualistic worldview, basing the sources of good and bad on certain individuals or groups. Which is why fascism as an ideology will always boil down to replacing one group they perceive to be in power with another group. Again though, Marxism is a systemic analysis that will always draw the same conclusions independent of who actually holds power, as capitalism is a social relation that works with the same fundamental laws regardless. This puts Marxism right in place to strike at the heart of the fascist alternative, by demonstrating how the ethno-state utopia still wouldn't deal with the problems it sets out to solve, as it's still based on the capitalist mode of production. Again, I'd like to draw on a point Zizek makes to help out here.
Eat it. As it was often pointed out, fascism is, at its most elementary, a conservative revolution. Revolution, economic development, modern industry, yes, but a revolution which would nonetheless maintain or even reassert a traditional hierarchical society. A society which is modern, efficient, but at the same time controlled by hierarchic values with no class or other antagonisms. Now, they have a problem here, the fascists. But antagonism, class struggle, and other tensions is something inherent to capitalism. Modernization, industrialization, as we know from the history of capitalism, means disintegration of old, stable relations. It means social conflicts. Instability is the way capitalism functions. So how to solve this problem? Simple. You need to generate an ideological narrative which explains how things went wrong in a society, not as the result of the inherent tensions in the development of this society, but as the result of a foreign intruder. Things were okay till Jews penetrated our social body. The way to restore the health of our social body is to eliminate the Jews.
Now this is so important because, as we've already discussed, fascism arises out of tensions and turmoils brought about by liberal society, i.e. capitalist society. It comes along with the intent to remedy these problems of modern society, return glory to its nation, go back to the good old days. This is the drive of fascism, but the Marxist analysis thoroughly shows how such goals are impossible even if all of their aims are met, And so, rather than dismissing the notion as impractical or immoral, Marxism can counter the underlying reasons for its growth in the first place, and furthermore offer its own alternative to the crumbling status quo. This alternative being, of course, the actual abolition of the capitalist mode of production, property relations, the value form, commodity fetishism, and alienation. The establishment of a society based on social relations as opposed to proxy interaction via the commodity. Of course, the pressing question now might be specifically how capitalism is inherently unstable, and how specifically might we reorganize society around this. But this goes far beyond the scope of this video. I might recommend either watching some of my other stuff I've included in the video cards, or perhaps just reading Marx directly. What's important here, though, is that Marxism provides both a thorough refutation to the fascist project, regardless as to what extent the Jews really are controlling us or the Muslims really are hoarding our countries, and at the same time offers a true alternative to the ills of liberal and wider capitalist society. If you remain adamant on maintaining your liberal ideals, you will always be giving the fascists the higher ground on merit of your own beliefs.